talk about, I mean, tonight this is not a nice, light topic. I know I usually kind of do light history, but this is not one of those times, because tonight's program really is, in fact, about death. And so if for any reason you are troubled by hearing about a lot of little children suffering terribly, or having rather graphic descriptions of the throat distemper, this would be the time to say, I think I'm supposed to be at the Academy program, and we will forgive you. All right, so the great throat distemper. There is absolutely nothing new about epidemics in the New World. That's the first thing we have to understand. America had gone through a series of epidemics, probably beginning with smallpox, which was brought over by the Europeans, and measles, and a lot of other diseases. And people were more used to, which doesn't mean that they were comfortable with it, but more used to the knowledge that your death was very close than we are perhaps today. We fight it now. If this is working, we're going to go forward. Take, for example, Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather is a well-known minister born in Massachusetts. His father was the Reverend Increase Mather. This is his family tree. And you will notice that he has 2 wives. Actually, he had 3 wives, but his 3rd wife did not have any children. But as you can see, only a few of them made it to adulthood. And of those that made it to adulthood, only 1 made it to what we would consider to be full adulthood. Now, some of these children died the very year they were born, within a month or 2. I believe it is Hannah, the first one who lives to be 1 year old, or one of the ones who lives to be 1 year old, who fell into the fireplace, another hazard of the times. Samuel, I don't know if it's Samuel, might be the other Increase. One of the young men was lost at sea when he was a young man. Must be Increase. And so it's tragic. And it's important to understand that his family tree, and he is a minister. No, he's not a minister, his father was. He's involved in the Salem witchcraft trials anyway. He gets very involved in that. He gets the fight on inoculation, he's involved in that as well. And he's also a Puritan. And that's going to become very important as we go along with our story. So, in New England, in spite of a terrible family history like you see with Cotton Mather, New England, once you settled here, was actually a better place to live. Survival rates in the New England area were actually better than England and Spain and Wales, for instance. You had a better chance of living to adulthood here. You definitely had a better chance of living to adulthood when compared to the southern states, and by the southern states, we're starting like with Philadelphia. Okay, so we're starting with Spain. And a lot of this has to do with our climate. As we know, at least once a year, we freeze the whole place solid, and so anything that might transmit any kind of germ, it dies. So yellow fever doesn't happen up here, malaria doesn't happen up here, but malaria used to come as far north as the Delaware area, and you don't see that today. So a lot of those diseases we didn't get here. And people tended to live in isolated communities in this area. Death rates do fall off sharply after the time period in the early 18th century. The death rate in New England, but not the rest of America, was 1/3 of that in England or France. It's healthier to live here, not by modern standards, but by global standards. 3 out of 10 children in Boston would die before their first birthday. And we talked about Cotton Mather. There are things that are endemic in the area that just always seem to be around the low-grade level, like scarlet fever, for instance, and measles. And measles is a terrible disease. I don't know if anybody is old enough to have gone through actual measles rather than being vaccinated for it. Yes. So you're in a dark room and trying to be hidden from sound and noise and such. That was an awful disease. Whether or not diphtheria was actually there before 1735 is questionable. There are hints that it existed in other parts of the world at this time period. But whenever you study diphtheria, they almost always will go back to Kingston, New Hampshire in 1735, which is a very odd place for it to start, because Kingston is not at a crossroads. So how come it happens there, and how people looked at it, are what we're going to examine tonight. But first, let's look briefly at the Pilgrims, at the Puritans. Don't confuse the Puritans and the Pilgrims. Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England. Pilgrims wanted to be separated from it. So that's your Thanksgiving lesson for today. Most of Massachusetts is founded by the Puritans. And New Hampshire is also a Puritan area. Even though the people who came to Exeter came because they were religious dissenters, but they were kind of more Puritan than the Puritans, and that's why they got thrown out. They believed in a certain type of Calvinism that we would today probably find rather harsh. It had to do with predestination. I think there are a few people today, there's probably still some people who are comfortable with the idea of predestination, but from the Puritans' point of view, it was based on 5 principles, 5 very important principles. You can use the acronym TULIP if you're going to describe it. The first being total depravity. All human beings are sinners of the most depraved kind. So once you accept that about yourself, everybody is a depraved sinner. 2 is unconditional election. At the dawn of time, God decided who was saved and who was not. And there was no shifting that. L is limited atonement. Even within that being saved, there are limits to who God would save and who God would not. But it's already decided. I have them out of order here, so I'm going T. I. Irresistible grace. If you were one of the chosen, you couldn't really avoid it. So there was no way that you could say, well, you know, I've been chosen, but I'm not going to do it. That wouldn't happen. You would find yourself drawn to this no matter what. And the final one is P, preservation of the elect. There is a covenant that seals this deal. Now, this is all very comforting if you are sure that you are one of those elect. Because the flip side of that, if you are not one of the elect, you are not going to spend eternity with God. You are going to spend eternity in the fiery pits of hell, which was terrifying to people. Life on earth was tough enough. Can you imagine what it would be like if it was in constant turmoil? So it was terrifying for people. This idea of the world and the afterlife threw people into some tension in their lives, because you spent a lot of time wondering if you were one of the elect. But wondering if you were one of the elect kind of showed that you didn't trust God, so you shouldn't really be wondering. You should just be trusting. But if you were trusting and you had just that little tiny bit of paranoia that we all have and you're just not sure, that was problematic. You'd also worry about whether your spouse was also one of the elect, because maybe you liked them and you wanted to spend eternity with them. But then again, like wives, you had to replace a lot, die in childbirth. And then there were your children who you worried about constantly. And one of the signs that people would look for to find out who the elect were, did the person prosper? These were capitalists, right? I mean, they really were. So if you prospered, then probably you were one of those chosen. And one of the ways of prospering was to show that you had a big family that did well. Well, that's great for Anne Hutchinson, who had 15 pregnancies and 14 live children who made it to adulthood. Wow. Not so easy on Cotton Mather, right? Because you look at his family here, and he must have really wondered at times. But he shouldn't have wondered, because if you wonder, you're questioning God. You can't question God because then you're not the elect. See how hard that is? Right. So we bring this all up because what's going to happen in Kingston is going to happen within this big soup of this Puritanism right at a time when people are starting to wonder whether maybe this system is really real. A period in the 1730s and 40s comes along called the Great Awakening. Sometimes called the First Great Awakening because there's another one later. What's going to happen is people begin to say, maybe it's not all about predetermination. Maybe what you do in your life, maybe if you live a good life, maybe that's what tips it over and gets you into heaven. But it doesn't happen yet. And so here we have this horrible thing that happens. So what happens? You're in an uncertain world. These people are comforted to know that God had everything planned out. Everything is fine. Their job, resist evil, accept God's will. And then something strange happens. And that something? Let me see where we're going from here. Okay, this is the Plains Cemetery in Kingston. If you've ever gone out there to visit it, I've tried reading the stones. They're almost all worn away at this point, but most of the people who died in the early days of the 1735 throat distemper are buried here. A lot of the children you would never find stones for because they were children, and they didn't always make gravestones for them. We found in Exeter that we have very few gravestones that are that old. One of our earliest cemeteries is a 1745 one up at Winter Street. We have a few scattered around here earlier than that. But like the people who lived here and died here in the 1600s and the 1680s didn't mark them very well. Okay. Look at some stones. This is a type of stone you see on these early New England gravestones, and it's called the Flying Death's Head. It was to remind you of your mortality, because you needed to remember that. If you were going to resist sin, you needed to remember that when you die, it's not nice. So you'll see this, and this is like a lot of random photos of tombstones that are from all around. We've got a bunch. Eventually, as the idea softens, there's a good close-up. That's probably where we took the tracing from. Eventually, the idea softens, and the skull turns from a skull into a cherub, a child's face. I can't see my slides from here. There we go. All right, so there we go. So this one's a little better. Want to get the lights for the meeting room? I have a plan. Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, so you can really see it here. It's suddenly turned to a child's face. And that's where it goes. We're up to 1794 in this stone, so you can see how over time things soften. And I'm going to go back just to show you the other one. Okay, you can see there's a big difference there. Okay, and eventually the whole flying head disappears entirely, and we go into things like this is the Ermine Willow, which shows more sadness. Because the Puritans were not allowed to grieve for their dead. Try picturing that for a moment. You were not supposed to grieve for your dead because it was God's will that they had died. And if it was God's will and you grieve, you are turning your face against God. So imagine that you're a parent and you lose a child and you're not allowed to grieve. Where do you turn that sorrow in your life? Okay, quick math. Folk tradition tells us that it all begins in Kingston. In April of 1735, when a man named Joseph Clough skinned a pig, which had died of a throat ailment. Joseph Clough, who is an adult, becomes sick and he dies of something they consider to be similar. Now I say it's folk tradition because there are a couple of authors who write about this and then say, well, the problem is we can't find a Joseph Clough in Kingston. So perhaps this never happened. So I was giving this talk a while back, and one of the local historians from East Kingston said, well, that's because he's from East Kingston. And I know where his land was, and I know where he's buried. And he died in 1735 of throat distemper. So we found Joseph Clough, so he's there. A few weeks later, a neighbor child died of a similar sickness, and then within a week, 3 more children in the same family died of the same illness. And it's characterized by fevers and strange spots on their throats. The death toll begins to mount in Kingston. 16 more people died by June. By December of 1635, there are 102 who died in Kingston, which was 14% of the population. Their usual death rate in a year was about 10 people. So it was extreme. And most of them were small children. Under the age of 5 was the most susceptible. Under the age of 10 is the next group. A few adults like Joseph Clough, but not many. And the adults who did die were usually women who had recently given birth, because their immunity was low at that point. The town minister in Kingston was a man named Reverend Ward Clark. He was actually from Exeter originally, but he was serving the community in Kingston. And he would visit the sick, as would the 2 local doctors, going from house to house to tend to the children who are sleeping 3 to a bed. And they would lay their hands on the children, and Ward Clark would try to comfort them in their suffering and hope that they had made their peace with God and hope that they had been saved. And the physicians, of course, would come in and do a variety of medical procedures which possibly hastened death. But they went from house to house. So as you can probably see, some of the blame for spreading this around goes to your minister and your doctor. Sometimes your doctor was not your best friend anyway, because at this time period in colonial America, medical practice was based on balancing of the humerus, as they called it. The belief was, and this goes all the way back to the Greeks, that the body was a balance between the 4 humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. And any of these were out of whack. That's what caused illness. So their whole goal was to draw the illness out of you. This could be done in a variety of ways. You could sweat it off by hot poultices. Now these are children who are already having raging fevers, so warming them up was not a problem. They were already hot. Or they would bleed you, open up a vein, and just bleed a person. I told you this is not a nice thing, so it's not going to be good. Or they could administer an emetic and make you vomit, or give you something that is going to be laxative, anything to purge the system of this horrible disease. So you're talking about feverish children who have this horrific sore throat, and then they induce fever and they induce purging and they become more and more dehydrated. And this particular illness, along with causing spots and severe sore throat, the back of the throat would develop what was called a pseudomembrane. It would form from each side of the tonsil, and it would cut off the windpipe so they couldn't breathe. So many of these children, if they weren't already dehydrated, would suffocate. It was a terrible, horrible death. So you probably didn't want to be treated by physicians, because that could go badly. The map is up because it shows where this particular illness travels. It travels north first. It starts out in Kingston, and it starts to head up the coast toward Maine, and then it goes down toward Massachusetts all the way into Connecticut. There are reports of it like 15 years later getting down as far as the Carolinas. Whether it was as virulent at that point as it was here is uncertain. The death rates were quite high. Here's Kingston. There's a bit of a spike in 1735. Give us the numbers, but there's a huge spike there. This is a letter. This is a very interesting letter. We don't have it here. It's actually up in the state archives up in Concord. We have copies of it. We also don't exactly know who it's from. It's written by somebody with the initials NG, which sounds like a Nathaniel or a Nicholas Gilman to me, but we aren't really sure. We do know who it is addressed to. It is addressed to Dr. Hale, who's living in Massachusetts. And this letter is the one I took the title for this program from. And he describes what is going on. He talks about the fact that there are whole families that have lost all of their children. The Reverend Ward Clark, in fact, his wife had just had a daughter. She dies. The baby dies. His other 3 children die. He found himself within a 2-week period a man with no family. And of course, he's going from house to house, house to house. There were people in Exeter who lost every single member of their family, or men who lost every single member of their family. The reason I first started studying this, in fact, was because I'd run into genealogists who would say, well, here's something weird. I'm studying my ancestors, and I get back to this one guy, and it's like he had 2 families. He had one family, and then everybody dies in 1735, 36, and then he marries again, and the next family seems to be okay. What is going on? So we had to kind of find out. It's very important. The area that actually gets hit the hardest is Hampton Falls. Hampton Falls was a small community. It had maybe 1,200 people living there. It's kind of a crossroads, though, Hampton Falls. People come in from Massachusetts, and they are heading to Portsmouth, or they're heading to Exeter. So there's a lot of people coming through. And they lost 17% of their population. And the stats are just horrific. There was one family that lost all 7 of their children. There were 2 families that lost all 6 of their children. There were 2 families that lost 5 children. There were, I can't see my handwriting, 6 families that lost 4 children and 14 families that lost 3. There were only 2 families in the entire town that had children who had none of them affected. So that's a particular town that really gets hammered in this. In the first 18 months of this outbreak, over 1,000 people died in the New England area. So they say it goes from Pemmican to Carolina, but it takes a long time to do that. In fact, when virologists are looking at this, or epidemiologists are looking at this, they consistently call it a very slow-moving epidemic, even though I'm looking at it going, oh, I would want to run away. But they said it was very slow, because it did. It takes from April until about June or July before it starts to get to Exeter, and eventually it keeps moving on. So there's some literature that I read that said 1735 to 1740 period, the New England area lost over 80% of its children. You can imagine that. Now remember, these are people who have a high fertility rate. And then it hits in waves. So 1735 to 40 is the biggest peak. And then there will be like 10 years, and then it comes back again. And then there will be a few more years and it comes back. So it keeps coming back in these waves, just long enough for you to like replace your entire family. And then the next bout will hit. So what was this disease? As far as we can tell, it's some sort of very virulent form of diphtheria, which did seem to be a new disease at the time. It's called diphtheria because it comes from the Greek word for the D-I-P-H part, which means leather. So that pseudomembrane that we talk about in the back of the throat was seen as this leather-like thing. They couldn't figure out exactly what it was. They kind of think that it might go all the way back to like 500 BCE, but we're not really sure. It certainly wasn't as virulent as it became in New England. Here's some of those peaks. This is just Hampton, so. But it does show you that it kind of pops back every now and again. Never as high as the 1735-36 outbreak. And people needed to know who to blame. Did you blame the pig? Did we get it from pigs? Or was it God? It was God. They knew the answer. The answer was God. The answer was they had sinned. And they had sinned worse than any other group of people ever, because why would God punish them by killing their little children? It was a horrible crisis of faith for people at this time period. And their lamentations, this is published in Boston, their lamentations really show, who with a sword already drawn are children to devour. It's quite harsh. God's judgments do abound. People could not understand, I know Ward Clark in particular, could not understand what they could have possibly done, but he knew they had done it. It's this guilty conscience. Everything they seemed to try to stop this disease did not work. Things that we would do today, which would be, take the sick kid and put him in a separate room, were things that were not really thought of back then. Children were clustered together all the time. They slept in the same bed together. They attended school together. They're Puritans. They have to know how to read, so even the small children are clustered around someone's mother learning their ABCs. They go to school together. They sat together in the pews at church. The children's had a section. And the children were required to carry their deceased friends to the graveyard. That was considered part of a reminder to them of their mortality. Once again, this constant idea of reminding yourself that this world can end and you need to be right with God right now. So that was hard. It was very hard on kids growing up in this time period. I talked about the treatments that people had. So they didn't understand about separating people very well. They kind of knew that about smallpox. So it's kind of funny that they understood that you should sort of quarantine smallpox. And there were some communities, like the Portsmouth area had a pretty good pest house system going on. A pest house is where you were sent if you had smallpox. Because they did understand that for some reason, if you're near someone with smallpox, you might get it. Why they didn't make the connection with diphtheria is beyond me, but they didn't. I think maybe because it was just a child's disease, and who wants to separate children from their brother who's comforting him? You want to keep them there. But some of the treatments were pretty hard. So if you're trying to balance things out, there are a few things that they might do. Let me see where we're going with this. Okay. Yes. Fun charts. First, they might bleed you. And they would use a device. I need light stuff. She's got it. She's got it. On it? All right. This doesn't look like much. It's actually an extremely sharp blade on the end of this. Now this one's from a later period. This is called a flea, and it's used to open a vein. And it would be used, they would bleed you one day, and then if that didn't seem to be working, they'd try it again. They say George Washington was basically killed by his doctors. He's one of, I think, a few presidents' death by doctor. But he had a very sore throat that he claimed, that they said he got from riding out in the cold, wet. We know that that doesn't cause sore throats. And it turned into an epiglottis, which was epiglottitis, which is an inflamed epiglottis. And he was having trouble speaking and breathing and had a very sore throat. So naturally, he asked one of his servants to bleed him. And then the doctor came and said, you know what we should do? Bleed him. So they did it again, and he didn't seem to be rallying, so we'll bleed him another time. And he lost, I don't know, like 19% of his blood at that time period. And it's probably what killed him. He probably could have survived the throat ailment. So, like I said, you have these children who are very dehydrated, very sick, extremely feverish, and then someone comes in and helps them with something like this. The other thing they might do, if bleeding wasn't enough, they might try cupping. You see the glass cup there? I'm just filling these are yogurt cups. But pretend that these are actual cups. And they were used to raise a blister on you. And so the way it was done was you held a candle inside, and it would create a vacuum, and you stick it on them, and it would bring up a blister. It became popular again during the Olympics a few years ago, and Michael Phelps was cupping, supposedly because it would bring the blood to the muscles. So, surprisingly enough, the world's fastest swimmer did pretty well. You can see, though, that he's got these big welts on him. Sometimes they can even go so far as to bring up blisters. So, you know, if you've got a horrific sore throat and you can barely breathe and you're feverish and someone has just bled you, this is going to really help. Okay, and that's not even counting if they managed to get anything into them, because it was very difficult for the child to swallow, that you know, they might do a purge. They might give them something that's going to make them vomit as well. So you can see where, however close you are to medical treatment could make a difference. The farther away you were from a doctor might actually improve your chances of survival in this kind of situation. The incubation period for diphtheria is from 2 to 5 days, although it can go as far as 10. So you never know who is possibly, oh, there's some. I think I took that picture down at Sturbridge Village. Those are not yogurt cups. There's George Washington. There is his doctor killing him. All right. We do know today what the diphtheria bacteria looks like. There's the bacterium, and then there's a little toxin that throws off of it. Artist's rendering. 2 or 4. Yes. Okay. It doesn't look like this. But anyway, if the bacterium itself doesn't get you, the toxin it throws off will start to affect the other body systems. So, you know, it's not bad enough that you're choking to death. You also have this problem. Scarlet fever was also floating around at the same time, and there was a lot of confusion between who had scarlet fever and who had the throat distemper. But actually, the signs of these things were quite different. The symptoms were quite different. Scarlet fever is going to give you a rash a lot of times, and you're not going to get that with throat distemper. But when you read early accounts of the one, you almost always find the other illness is also circulating around. You have a better chance of surviving scarlet fever. Today you could survive all of this with antibiotics, but that wasn't available for a long time. It's not until the 1890s that they begin to find some sort of treatment for diphtheria. Go back to diphtheria. Here we go. That's a better monster. Okay. In the 1890s, they developed a few things. First, they developed one treatment, which was to put a tube down the throat so that the person could breathe. Not quite a tracheotomy. And I did have somebody back in 2005, I think, when I first did this program, who described to me a great aunt who had told her about how somebody in the family had diphtheria. This is like, you know, a friend of a friend of a friend. But who said that the treatment they had was that the doctor put a knife down their throat and then put a silver tube in so they could breathe. And we looked it up, and then actually that was a treatment that's developed in about the 1890s. So it wasn't unheard of to have something like that done. And that would at least assist in breathing. It's not going to help you if you get that toxin in and then it takes over your body, but it will at least slow things down while you breathe. Then an antitoxin is developed in the 1890s made out of a horse serum. This was also something that they would sometimes give prophylactically to everybody in the family, but it was also given to anybody who first started to show symptoms. And if you caught it early enough, you could save them. You had to catch it early, which wasn't always the case. You have 3 to 5 days when this is percolating. In any event, it had nothing to do with the pig. The pig probably caught it from someone else. The question is, where did Joseph Clough pick it up? And it's entirely possible that he had just gotten that pig a few weeks beforehand and interacted with someone else who had a low level of it or something like that, and then went on and nobody caught anything of it. But it was probably not the pig. If anything, the pig got it from him. This little girl is Alice Yeaton. And she's little in this picture. She's only a few years old in this picture. But she died at the age of 6 of diphtheria here in Exeter. Her teacher left us a little message about her. And it was very common for teachers to lose a lot of students, something that rarely happens today for teachers. I mean, I only lost a few, and they were teenagers, and it was tragic, but little kids, you don't usually see it so much. Her teacher, Annie Davis, wrote of her in the Exeter Newsletter, "Little Helen, Thursday of last week I watched from the schoolhouse window 3 small children running merrily to school. Their leader was little Helen Yeaton. This was her last day of school and play. Friday her seat was vacant, and Saturday she was in Christ's keeping. Helen was a member of the 2nd grade and ready for promotion to the 3rd, though only 6 years of age. Seldom has it been my privilege to have a pupil with such a bright, responsive mind. She endeared herself to all who knew her. She will live in our hearts as a pleasant memory of sweet childhood." Helen dies in 1912, which is 20 years practically after the antitoxin was developed, so clearly it wasn't a cure-all. But it at least halted a bit. This was one of those diseases that people really feared, and you can see why. I mean, it's quite fatal. We don't get it today primarily, not because it isn't out there. It is still out there, but most of us are vaccinated against it. It takes, I think, 4 vaccinations for a child to build up immunity, and you have to get a booster about every 10 years. So every time you go in and get a tetanus shot, you're probably also getting a tetanus and diphtheria shot. Keep those up. I always bring up Balto because when I was a kid, I used to see the Balto statue that's in the middle of Central Park in New York. It's not in the middle, but it's in Central Park in New York. Balto was a sled dog in Alaska. And in Nome, Alaska in 1925, they had an outbreak of diphtheria, and the kids were starting to get sick, and they needed the antitoxin. And it was far away in Nome, and they had to travel thousands of miles to get there, and it was the middle of winter, and Balto was the lead sled dog. And it's the beginnings of the Iditarod sled dog race, but Balto was the big hero. They made a cartoon movie out of it, and it's not good, but but I always think of Balto. Whenever I think of diphtheria, so I had to make sure he was in my program. This is a 1901 school record. The reason I point it out is because this particular teacher, who had beautiful handwriting, was keeping a list of her students. And one of the things you'll notice is the way she's marking them absent. Now today when kids are in school, I don't know what the list, how many absences they are allowed, but it is unusual for a child to miss more than like 3 or 4 days of school. And if they do miss more than that, it's usually scattered throughout the year. If you look at early school records from the early part of the 20th century, what you will see is children who are sometimes out for weeks at a time. Because these illnesses did not have any kind of treatment. And so because of that, it was just supportive. And you hoped your child survived the initial attack, and then you hoped that nothing would develop after that. And then you might be quarantined for 2 weeks. So the little tiny slash marks that she's putting in this record are to mark when kids are absent. And you'll notice there's a mark at the top of the square and a mark at the bottom of the square. That's because there were 2 sessions of school every day. You had them from about 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning until noon, then everybody went home for lunch until 1, and they'd come back from 1 to 4. So she's marking the morning and the afternoon sessions. And you can see that there are some children who are out for long periods of time. I only scanned this one section because I didn't have enough room. But you go through these records and you will sometimes see children who are out for 2 and 3 weeks. Imagine that kind of interrupted schooling. I mean, today, if your child is out 2 days, you start getting the homework assignments start piling up, even for 3rd graders. And the poor kid is now trying to get over this big illness, and then they have all this homework to do. So it doesn't make it much easier. But interrupted schooling was another problem that lasted until finally, in the late 1940s, they were able to come up with a vaccination for this. So I talked about the first period of treatment, which was balancing out the humors. Things get a little better when you get to the 19th century, a little better. In that they would at least understand that they should perhaps hydrate these children. So this is from a medical journal in 1838. They called it quinsy, or inflammatory sore throat. There's a lot of different names for this. You'll see things like putrid canker of the throat. It's horrible, horrible. Putrid means you've got a phlegm, of course, which is the nasties. They describe this as a disease to which children are more subject than the aged. It's distinguished by a sense of heat, pain, and tightness in the senses and throat, accompanied by a difficulty of swallowing, particularly fluids. Generally, the inflammation begins in one tonsil, then spreads across the palate and seizes the other tonsil. When the inflammation possesses both sides, the pain becomes very severe and swallowing is performed with extreme difficulty. Causes: wet feet, of course. Throwing off of the neck cloth, or drinking cold water when overheated. As the quinsy is caused by cold, it must be removed by heat, the opposite of cold. So they then they then advise that you make pennyroyal tea, use cayenne and vinegar sweetened with honey. External applications are likewise of great use, bathing the neck with pepper sauce. That'll help. Applying a flannel wet with it, applied around the neck. Onions softened with goose oil and applied are also excellent for this disease. So you can see that this is a great recovery. But at least they're not bleeding you anymore. Vaccination finally comes in the 1940s, after World War II, really. Before that, you still had people coming down with this. And by the 1940s, it's combined with pertussis and tetanus, and rates since the 1950s have dropped markedly, but in the early 20th century, it can still be a major killer. If you are unvaccinated and you come down with diphtheria today, it still has a very high mortality rate. Even with treatment, if you wait too long, it can have a 10% mortality rate, so you do have to be cautious with this. Why did it hit New England so hard? Well, part of it might have been that isolated communities like Kingston lacked a herd immunity. That could be why cities fared better, but we're not sure that cities fared better, because cities were probably underreporting the number of deaths. The number of deaths that we have reported for the New England area also does not count deaths in the native population. It only counts it in the white population. So we really don't know how it's affecting other people. Medical practices weakened the patients and did more harm than good. Another problem. Religious ministrations actually spread the disease, as did the burial practices of having an uninfected child carrying an infected child's body to the grave. Close quarters exposed everyone to the disease. The worst outbreak lasts about 5 years, and then it keeps coming back in waves. We don't suppress diphtheria really until the 1940s. So, that was that outbreak. But because it's 2018, we're going to talk about something else briefly. Because it's the 100th anniversary of the 1918 flu epidemic. So let me shift courses here. We'll talk about flu. And we just had a very bad flu season. That was a little bit creepy when that one came in, just when we were remembering the old one. Oh, other things to remember about diphtheria. You can get it twice. You can get it 3 times. You don't develop a lifetime immunity. That's why you keep having to have booster shots for it. Influenza, of course, is one of those things where it keeps mutating all the time. There's just new influenza every year. And if you had one, you may not get another one. Oddly enough, people who survived the 1918 flu epidemic had a less likely chance of getting the 1968 Hong Kong flu. Who knew? Grandma was doing fine. All right, so we'll talk about influenza 1918. 1918 is a year where at the beginning of the year, we are involved in World War I. A lot of our young men are overseas, living in close quarters, exposed to people they have never met before. So we have men from the south who are suddenly interacting with men from the north, from the Midwest, from all over, from France, from Spain. It's frequently called the Spanish flu, and there's a good reason for that. Spain was not involved in World War I. They didn't have any press censorship, so they weren't being forced to suppress any information, so Spain kept letting out the information. Oh, this flu! Look at this flu! It's everywhere! Meanwhile, in Britain, they were not letting people know that information, and they would keep it out of the newspapers, even though everybody had flu. But they wouldn't say that because it would hurt morale, and these were times when you needed to keep patriotism at a high point, and you couldn't frighten people. And they're doing Liberty Loan drives where everybody gets together in a huge group. And in the middle of, well, at the end of 1918, of course, the war ends, and then there are victory parades at like the worst possible time during this outbreak. Interestingly enough, though, our good old Exeter Newsletter, which has been published since 1831, doesn't seem to have abided by any kind of censorship. Either they didn't get the memo, or they just figured Exeter people could take it. Because they, by September, I think in early September, people started to get ill. But it was just like, school had just started and there's stuff around and, is it a cold? I mean, you get fall allergies, maybe that's all it is. It seemed like an awful lot of people that were coming down with pneumonia. And instead of it being the little kids or the old people, it was like the 30-somethings, and that was weird. By the end of September, they started to really notice something was up. Here, I just put these slides together today, so I'm going to make sure I'm paying attention. So they call it the Spanish influenza, and my family always called it that. Is that what you remember hearing until about 10 years ago? Right. If you heard of it at all, because the weirdest thing about the Spanish influenza or the 1918 flu is how we forgot about it, and nobody talked about it. And it kills like a fifth of the world population. It's huge. And yet, nobody talked about it, except some families. And when I talk to families now, they always seem to say, oh yeah, I had an uncle that died of that. And it was something that my family always knew about, but I didn't realize how big it was until many years later. And I'll tell you why my family knows about it in a little while. So the flu hits Exeter, and you can see they're doing all the right things. They closed the schools, and they stopped public meetings, and the newspapers are just a long list of every organization that felt they needed to cancel. It's like when there's a big snowstorm and you get all the cancellations on the news and you're like, oh, just stay home. Why are you people even looking? So that was a problem then too. And so the Grange Hall is closing down and the churches are conflicted. Should they hold services or should they not hold services? And things like the Red Cross are trying to decide, well, it's our patriotic duty to roll bandages. We really should get to that. But then again, should we maybe start doing something about this flu? Here's this is funny. This is the diary of Helen Tufts. She was 21. She lived on Pine Street. Her father was a teacher over at Phillips Exeter Academy, so she was one of the swanky people in town. She graduated from the Robinson Female Seminary, and as a young woman, she wasn't really supposed to have a job. She was really supposed to find a husband, right? She doesn't get married until her late 30s. So she's sort of at home at this point, and every Friday she would go into Boston on the train, she'd get her hair done, and she'd go to the symphony, and she'd get a piano lesson. She does work as a piano teacher, so she's very genteel, she's a piano teacher. This particular Friday, though, is the first inkling we get in her diaries, and she kept a diary from the time she was 13 until she was 90. And we have those. So anytime I want to look at what's going on in Exeter between 1908 and 1990-something, I can go check Betty Tufts. So here she is, and the only thing that she notices is that there's too much influenza, so I decided not to go to Boston. And then she goes about her life. And then about 3 days later, you ignore the part where she's saying she's digging her potatoes at the very beginning, because she had a victory garden, because it's World War I. Came in to see Mother a minute, and Mr. Perry called up and asked me if I'd help at the gym in the improvised hospital for influenza patients. Phillips Exeter Academy did not close, because they realized that if they sent all the boys back to their homes on the trains, they might actually be spreading the illness rather than containing it. So what they did was they kept the boys in town, and the boys who fell sick were kept in the gym, isolated. I wish they'd taken a picture because it would have been a really interesting photograph so you get a sense of how close they kept them and whether or not they were far enough apart to not spread it. Anyway, Helen Tufts goes over there to help. The improvised kitchen is screened off at one end of the big hall, made toast and served water to all the boys, etc. Worked till after 3, had dinner at home at 3:30, went back at 5, worked till after 8. She is invigorated by all this. 7 hours working down at the gym. Praise be, I'm really helping in this epidemic. It's a grand feeling, for it's all in the sense of patriotism and no salary connected, none of that dirty wages. Wouldn't want that. People who want to be paid. Okay. So worked as usual in the gym, helped sweep the floor. There's something new. She does a lot of cleaning around the house. I really can't pick on her. She was a wonderful person. Gave out a little medicine. She's working under Mrs. Bigelow, who was the nurse there. And then she's home by 8:15. You probably know where this is going, right? You probably already know what's going to happen. Okay. Did some house cleaning before going to the gym, worked busily there over the dinner serving, etc. And then when she gets home, she says, pretty much all in. Mother read to me while I rested in the study, but I coughed somewhat and seemed to have a cold. So she didn't wish me to go back to the gym. She telephoned Father to let the gym people know, and Dr. K, Dr. Kennison. Father telephoned that Miss Holm, the nurse, said for me to go to bed. Then the doctor comes over and says, stay in bed until you're well. The temperature is 100.4. But it's evident I have a cold at least. She totally had influenza. She did not get as sick as many of the boys, and it did not convert to pneumonia. So she was lucky. She's 21 years old, which is the risky age to get the flu at this point in time, because that's the people it was targeting. And then her diary kind of takes a turn, so to speak. She was devoted to keeping this diary. Blank pages are very unusual. So she actually was sick for about 2 or 3 weeks and then goes back and tries to fill in where she was. That's why she made that sideways note there that says, from here, for the next 2 weeks, the details are likely not accurate. For it was written up quite a while afterward. The next 2 weeks are page after page of her saying who came to visit her. So how did the flu spread? She completely recovered, though. That's good to know. And then we start to see things are closed. A.T. Dudley closes up the Red Cross. The Rockingham County Farm is quarantined. We start to see deaths listed in the newspaper. They almost always say they're death from pneumonia. Sometimes it will say like grip. There are other things they will sometimes call it, but you can tell what it is after a while, until eventually the newsletter has so many long obituaries that it just starts putting them all in the same column and saying it is the same thing. This has been sadly notable in regards to the number of deaths from pneumonia following the prevalent influenza. And it's one right after another. The one in the upper corner here is a Phillips Exeter Academy student. Stanislaus Jankowskis is a Lithuanian immigrant. Come around here. Edith Clark is the daughter of immigrants. Josephine Carbonneau is an immigrant also. What's her name over here? Mrs. Frances Larry is a woman who contracts the influenza and she dies. She had just had a baby. The influenza was really hard on postpartum women. They suffered terribly. They would bleed out and it was awful. Her baby survives, I checked. So all of these people from any class of the society could come down with the influenza, and the newspaper is just, it's like this. It's obituary after obituary, cancellations. Then they tried to announce on the October 11th, things are getting better. They were not. They intend to open the schools the following week, and they don't. The IOCA says, we're going to open as soon as the schools open, and they don't. The middle one you see there is kind of a little tricky one because it looks like it's a wedding announcement. They rushed the wedding because she was sick with influenza, and if you get to the end of it, she dies. And that wasn't the only one I read like that. There was another one that was from the Hampton area where it was a young couple who had just gotten married like in June, and then he loses his wife. The most prominent member of the town who died of influenza was probably Robert Kent. He was not as young in this photo as he was, he was a little older than the photo. He'd gone off and served in World War I, had come home. He was the one his mother was counting on to take over the Exeter Manufacturing Company. His father had died and his mother was kind of running the mill, and she had 2 sons, and she's waiting for Robert to come home from college so he can run the mill. He comes home from college, he goes off to a war, and she's waiting for him to come home from war, comes home from the war, and then sadly dies in the flu epidemic. And Adelaide has to run the mill for a few more years until her next son in line can survive. Right, Richard? All right. So what does an immigrant do if their whole family is way far away and then the relative dies? This is what they did. This is actually my family. I asked my mother about Spanish influenza because we have an old story in our family about Spanish flu. And I said, so it was just like Tante Fanny that died. And she said, oh no. And she starts rattling off all these names of people I hadn't even heard of. I did not know this man existed. This would be my great-grand-uncle. In other words, the man with the mustache is my great-grandfather, Antanas Rimkunas. This was his brother, Augustinus, who I had never heard of, and his wife, Casimira, who I also hadn't heard of because she, after his death, marries the man standing behind her, whose last name is Puskanigas. So I kind of knew about him. And I'm not sure the other harsh woman there, whose name was my great-aunt Tess, but I think her name was really Antonina. But what you would do this, you would cluster the family around at the wake and take a photograph that you could then send back to Lithuania or wherever they were from, so that you could say, this has happened, here you are, you're at the wake, you have to do your respects. So these photos exist, and you'll find them out there. They're not as creepy as the dead children laying on the couch, like you're sleeping.
With their eyes pinky.
Yeah, if you're giving a tour to 4th graders and you're pulling out old photos to show them, and there's this kid that's laying there sleeping, be very careful where you go with that conversation. Okay, but this is not what I knew. I had heard the story about the 2 great aunts. One of them was ill with the flu and the other one took care of her, but she died anyway, and so the whole family comes in, they take her off to be buried in another one of these mass graves. This is all in New York. In this mass grave, and while they were at the funeral, the sister who had been taking care of her died, and they found her. I heard about them, and we didn't even know their names very well. One of them was Magda, we don't know the other one's name. I don't know how they're related. The one I heard about is related to this. This little necklace has come down in my family since 1918. It's called Tante Fanny's lavalier. My mother used to show it to us when we were kids, and she'd say, you have to wear this at your wedding. I wore it at my wedding. It's Tante Fanny's lavalier. And the story that went along with it was that Tante Fanny, whose name is Stephanie, had been engaged to a dashing young man who her family did not approve of. And he gave her the lavalier as a present, and they were due to be married. But unfortunately, she got the flu, and she died, and it was this terrible family tragedy. So in typical fashion, you wear the lavalier from the dead great aunt at your wedding. It's good luck. He didn't say it made sense. But what he did was he kept the Spanish influenza story alive in my family, that they didn't forget it. I did not know about the other man. I didn't even know there was a branch to that side of the family. I didn't know I could never figure out how the Puskanigases were related to us. Now I know. But I did know about Tante Fanny's lavalier, and I did wear it when I got married, and it's been 33 years, so it took. Tante Fanny is the little girl standing on the side. My grandfather is the 3-year-old who is being restrained in his father's knees. This is the German side of my family, so it's the other side. This is 1903, so Tante Fanny's quite little at this time period. So some of the stories come alive, and you'll meet people who still remember the 1918 flu epidemic. Wipes out a huge amount of people in the world. Exeter technically only lost 75 people that we've been able to trace directly to the flu. But the fact that it would be one family, the Toole family on, write them down, they were on Garfield Street. Took 3 family members. They were a tight-knit Irish family, and they lost 3, a mother and then 2 children. The children were adults at the time. But these things did happen, and once it got into a household, it would take people out. And then the war ends in the fall of 1918. And there's a big celebration in town. Even Helen Tufts, who was only about 3 weeks from getting over the flu, went down to the bandstand to celebrate. and they had a big kind of dance party down there, there's no other way to describe it, to celebrate the armistice. And then there's a wave of more deaths in December. And then there's a wave more in the spring of 1919. People forget that the 1918 flu goes through 1919. There's a lot of deaths there too. There are some towns in New England where you can go through the cemetery and just look at the gravestones, and it's like 1918, 1918, one after another. If you go up to Barry, Vermont, where the Rock of Ages is, and they have that really fascinating cemetery up there with all the carved stones that have race cars on them and such. But if you can get past the sculpture art that's in there and just look at the stones, that was a really hard-hit community. There are tons of stones that just in 1918. And then we forgot about. That's the one thing about the 1918 flu epidemic that is the weirdest thing. We forgot about it. In the 1920s, there's an epidemic of sleeping sickness that also goes through the United States that hits children, and a lot of them were permanently put into a catatonic state, and we've forgotten about that one too. There's more work to do on that one in researching it for Exeter. But for today, I want you all to get a booster shot. And don't be afraid. I guess that's the message. Thank you for coming. I know this wasn't the lightest topic of the night, but it was fascinating nonetheless. And if you go back into your family history, you might find that there are some trends that you will see. We'll have to talk about tuberculosis another time. Questions, John?
Thank you for sharing stuff about Great Aunt Betty.
I always love her.
Yes. And I had two quick questions about the first one. Was there any evidence that it came from Europe, or was there any of that diphtheria stuff? And secondly, did it affect the livestock?
Doesn't seem to have affected the livestock with the exception of Joseph Clough's pig.
Okay.
At least I've never seen anything. And like I said, I think that's a folktale. As for did it come from other places, there are indications that some sort of illness similar to it had been around, but never on the epidemic levels that we saw in America in 1735. I read something briefly today, and then I went, what? And then kept going, because I didn't have enough time to pursue it, of some sort of epidemic that was affecting parts of South America around Chile that seemed to be similar. So it's possible that it's cropping up in other areas. Why it suddenly became so deadly in this area is still something of a mystery.
Thanks.
Scary stuff. These things can pop up, yeah.
Barbara, in researching my grandfather's service in the Army in World War I, not too much, he never talked about it, and the records have been burned in that fire. But I found a very interesting narrative about the troop ship, the Leviathan, which sailed across about 8 times, taking men over and then bringing them back. And late September 1918, it was sailing with, I think, 10,000 men on this ship, and some women also. 90 of them died of influenza during the trip. They had sick bays everywhere, and when they landed in Brest, Spain, 900 of them went to the hospitals. And I had heard that the outbreak was actually traced to someplace like Fort Dix.
Fort Devon gets blamed a lot. There's a spot out in Kansas too.
Yeah.
But for the longest time, I would always see Camp Devon getting the blame right here in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And Helen Tufts' brother was serving at Fort Devon, and her father keeps going down to visit him. Right in the middle of her being sick, he goes down to Fort Devon. I'm like, that's a good idea. But it had already broken out down there. He somehow managed to not catch it, which is pretty amazing. The governor of New Hampshire caught it. He survived, but there's notices that he is ill. The Boston postmaster was one of the first deaths in the New England area. I mean, it really affected a lot of people. The troop ships were just, it was just a cauldron of bacteria.
And they talked this narrative was wonderful. It was written clearly by people who had been on it.
Yeah.
They talked about how the sick bay got so overcrowded, and somebody would die, and somebody who was sick would just crawl into that bed. They were so sick. Yeah, yeah.
And that would have been Arthur Tufts' mother, or related to Arthur Tufts, who was here back
Helen
in
was
the
his
day?
sister. There's
Helen,
what, 3 or 4 Arthur Tufts.
Betty was Arthur Tufts' aunt.
Right.
She's my great aunt. And Arthur is my uncle. Or was.
What was the date on that school absence chart, you know?
That was 1901.
1901.
It was the Kingston Road School.
Sure, which is next to the river. Used
Yeah,
to
it
be
doesn't
one,
exist. It's a little one-room schoolhouse. They never seem to have more than about 12 students there.
it used to be, it's been enlarged. Bob Stewart lived there for years.
Oh, wow.
Bob and Arlene, it's right by the river on the left going out. But the names are, familiar from that
All the same.
neighborhood. Perkins is Perkins Hill.
It's whatever changes in Exeter. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you so much for